So many of you know that I am not a native New Hampshireite. And when we were planning to move to New Hampshire, the thing that my spouse, Tristan, was the very most excited about was the idea of having the slogan, "Live free or die," on our license plate. Now, this is not necessarily because he believes in the slogan, but more because he just revels in the intensity of it. Now, I, on the other hand, have always had a distaste for the motto. I'm being real honest with you today. It's not that I hate freedom per se, but rather that there seem to be too many interpretations of what freedom means these days. And very few of those interpretations seem to line up with the world in which I would like to live. Unsurprisingly, the motto, "Live free or die," has Revolutionary War origins. It's credited to a letter from General John Stark, a New Hampshire-born war hero, who wrote the words in 1809 as a toast to the veterans of the Battle of Bennington. He wrote, "Live free or die. Death is not the greatest of evils." But Stark wasn't the first one to use this phrase. There are a number of statements over the years that have posed this idea that freedom is worth dying for. "Vivre libre ou mourir" was the motto during the French Revolution. And of course, there was that famous line from Patrick Henry's 1775 address to the Second Virginia Convention, "Give me liberty or give me death." Similar phrases have also been used throughout history in Barcelona, the Azores, Scotland, and Haiti. Wherever there has been revolution, it seems, there has been this desire to proclaim freedom as key to making life worth living. Now, in this context of revolution, the phrase certainly makes sense. I'm still not sure I love it, but the intensity of it at least seems warranted. However, the way the phrase gets used these days is, I believe, quite toxic. It's less about freedom from tyranny and more about people getting to do whatever they want, without regard to how it affects other people. It is in the definition of freedom that the whole thing becomes problematic. Here in New Hampshire, when we talk about being the live free or die state, people are often talking about things like the lack of income tax or sales tax, the fact that you don't have to wear a helmet on your motorcycle, and the absence of a law requiring car insurance. Those are my favorite examples. It's used as an argument against government interference, as well as against government assistance. This version of freedom is very focused on the individual and on a desire not to be told what to do under any circumstances. Now, it doesn't necessarily come from a bad place. We all like the idea of freedom, right? No one's like anti-freedom here. But when taken to these extremes, freedom becomes an incredibly harmful concept, one that encourages us each to think only of ourselves and not of the impacts of our decisions and actions on the larger world. Now, this is, of course, where that grumpy gecko begins in the story we heard earlier, annoyed at the fireflies because they are disturbing his individual right to sleep. But as the tiger goes through the jungle talking to the various animals, we discover that it is all a necessary part of the way things work. If that gecko is going to survive, the rains can't stop raining, and so too can the fireflies not stop flashing. After all, we do not live in self-governed vacuums. Rather, we live in an interdependent web. What affects one of us affects us all. And so we cannot insist on a freedom that is based on individualism. Now, back in the early 2000s, a group of libertarians here in New Hampshire learned that lesson the hard way. In an effort called the Free Town Project, they sought to take over the small town of Grafton, New Hampshire, and turn it into a libertarian utopia where everyone had the freedom to live as they pleased. Their goal was to showcase what the world could be like if they implemented their principles on a broader scale. And they chose New Hampshire specifically because of the live free or die attitude. People from across the country moved to Grafton in large enough numbers that they could effectively take over the town government and get rid of every possible rule, regulation, and tax expense. Now, they didn't manage to pass all of the initiatives that they wanted to, but they did enough to fundamentally change the way Grafton worked, cutting all the town services down to a bare bones budget. Unsurprisingly, there were some negative consequences to this grand experiment. Neighbor complaints went up, crime went up, and the town had its first murder in living memory. And then the bears showed up. You see, a lot of these newcomers were living in non-traditional housing, tents and container homes, hand-built yurts, and the like. And as Matthew Hongel Tetling put it in his book, A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear, he says, it turns out that if you have a bunch of people living in the woods in non-traditional living situations, each of which is managing food in their own way and their waste streams in their own way, you're essentially teaching the bears in the region that every human habitation is like a puzzle that has to be solved in order to unlock its caloric payload. And so, the bears started to take notice of the fact that there were calories available in these non-traditional housing. Some of the bear attraction was unintentional, a result of throwing away waste without regulation. But others actually intentionally put food out for the bears, just for the joy of watching them eat. There was one woman they called the donut lady because she'd put donuts out for the bears. It was all very confusing for the bears, as some humans threw food at them, while others put out booby traps or threw firecrackers. And the bears just got more and more aggressive as they realized that there was, in fact, food available if they were bold enough to get it. This all culminated in 2012 when a woman in Grafton was attacked in her home by a black bear, the first black bear attack in New Hampshire for at least 100 years. A few years later, there was another attack in a neighboring town. The bears weren't the only reason that the Freetown Project eventually fell apart, but they certainly helped move things in that direction. Now, this story of the libertarians and bears in Grafton is just one example of what can happen when individual people make choices about how to live without regard to the effects that it might have on others. This kind of freedom just doesn't work, and it is so counter to our Unitarian Universalist theology of interdependence. If we believe that we are all connected, then it is also true that our fates are connected, that we cannot live without taking each other into account. And if this is the case, then we need to start to reimagine what freedom looks like. What if it is not this individualistic version of freedom, but rather a communal freedom that we are striving for? A freedom that goes beyond us as individuals and encompasses our whole society. I love the vision of freedom as a promise that Reverend Julian Jamaico Soto lays out in the poem Dick read. You must know, they say, that inside you are entire universes, milky blue, magenta, and gold, expanding. But to actually be free, you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside of everyone else. Being free is not a license but a promise. Not a license, but a promise. What does that mean for us? It means that freedom is not an excuse to do whatever we want, whatever most benefits us as individuals. It means that there's some responsibility that comes with freedom, responsibility to think outside ourselves. It means that whatever ways in which we have found freedom ought to be used to ensure the freedom of others. It means that we cannot be fully free until everyone is free, that individual freedom is not enough and will never be enough. Now, I'm sure you may be thinking by this point, but I'm not a libertarian who would feed the bears. And this may well be true, but the lure of individualism is insidious. And I have seen the way individualistic expressions of freedom creep into Unitarian Universalism in particular. So do not think that we are immune to any of this. Our commitment to freedom of belief, to freedom of assembly, to being a free church puts us at risk for this lure of individualism. It often comes as an anti-authoritarian streak, which we're kind of proud of, right? A sense that no one can tell me what to do, a distaste for anything that is required. It's why our National Unitarian Universalist Association is so careful to always frame what they do as recommendations, to be clear that it is congregations who are really the ones in charge. I've also seen it crop up sometimes in the way people make choices around their financial gifts to congregations. I've heard of folks who, for example, pay less once they no longer have kids in faith formation because they're no longer getting that service, or who will only give money to specific things because they want to control exactly how it is spent. This is not all that different from the fights about funding public schools with property taxes, right? We have a responsibility to one another, here in our small community, in our state, and in our larger world. Any freedom we have found comes with it that promise, the promise to work for the freedom of others. Because we know that none of us is free until all of us are free, that our liberation is all bound up together, that we are connected. So perhaps we need not throw away our state motto. I don't think we have that power anyway. But instead redefine it. If it has to be on our car, let's redefine it, right? Live free or die means something else entirely if you put it in the context of interdependence. It means that we fight with all our lives for the liberation of all people. It means that we take bold stances so that no one is left behind. It means that we maybe even pay a little bit more in taxes so that everyone in our state can get what they need to survive. It means that we promise each other our lives, and in return, perhaps one day, we will all find true freedom together. May it be so.